Summer 1943. The train screeched across the red plains of Texas, its iron wheels howling like something alive. Inside, the German prisoners sat in stunned silence, their uniforms sun-bleached and stiff from dust. Through the slats of the rail car, they glimpsed a horizon so wide it looked as if the earth itself had surrendered. The smell of cattle and magnolia mixed with engine smoke, a strange perfume that didn't belong to war. Lieutenant Karl Müller pressed his palm to the wood, feeling the rhythm of the land beneath them. "So, this is America," he murmured, not sure if it was a question or disbelief. When the doors opened, heat rushed in like a living thing. The men blinked into sunlight, so white it made their eyes ache. Instead of hatred or shouting, there were calm voices, American guards with rolled sleeves and sunburned necks, offering water in tin cups. Karl had expected cruelty, humiliation, some display of triumph. Instead, a sergeant said, "Welcome to Texas, fellas. Keep it easy, and we'll all get through this." The irony stung more than chains ever could. Beyond the fence stretched fields of corn and cotton, green as paradise. The men were herded toward their new world. Camp Hearn, though it looked more like a small town than a prison. Rows of wooden barracks, a mess hall, a canteen. A flag fluttered over the gate, the stars and stripes flickering like a flame in the wind. Hans Becker, once a farmer from Bavaria, squinted at the sky. "At least the weather's good for potatoes," he joked, and a few men laughed despite themselves. That small sound, the first laughter since capture, fell into the hot wind like a fragile seed. Captain James Reed watched from the porch of the command hut. He was a tall man with the easy posture of someone who'd seen too much to be impressed anymore. He didn't like war, but he believed in order, and these men, these supposed enemies, were his responsibility now. The prisoners looked thin, cautious, still half-fed on propaganda. Reed made a note in his logbook. Condition, healthy. Morale, uncertain. Then he looked up again, almost curious. "What do you do," he wondered, "when your enemy is just a bunch of homesick farm boys with polite manners?" The Red Cross nurse arrived that same day, a small woman in a khaki uniform, sharp as a pin. Sister Eleanor Brooks carried herself like someone who'd learned compassion by force. She checked the infirmary, counted bandages, inspected the food stores. When she saw the prisoners working the field, she said quietly to Reed, "They look tired." Reed replied, "So do we all." Yet there was a softness in his tone that didn't match the stripes on his shoulder. At night, the camp glowed like a lantern in the dark prairie. Crickets chirped beyond the wire. From the barracks came the low hum of German songs. Tired men remembering home through melody. Karl lay awake on his cot, staring at the ceiling fan. He had been an artillery officer, proud, certain of his nation's destiny. Now, under this foreign sky, certainty felt like a luxury. He thought of his father's voice, of old church bells in Frankfurt, of the promises they believed in. Somewhere in the dark, Hans muttered, "Do you think they hate us?" Karl hesitated. "I think they pity us." Days fell into a pattern of work and waiting. The men plowed fields, built fences, painted barns. They were paid 80 cents a day, not in cash, but in dignity. In return, they ate better than they had in months. There were eggs, bacon, sometimes even milk. "American propaganda," Hans said, licking his spoon. "They're trying to fatten us up for surrender." Karl smiled faintly. Then let them try. But part of him wondered if surrender was already happening, not on battlefields but quietly in the small mercies of routine. The townspeople nearby came to watch sometimes, curious and cautious. Women in summer dresses brought pies for the guards. Children pointed at the prisoners, whispering. To them, the Germans looked like strange exotic birds, tall, blonde, polite. Once, an old farmer asked Reed if the POWs could help with harvest. "They know farming," he said, "and I got land enough to share." Within a week, a dozen Germans were out picking melons beside Texans under the same brutal sun. It was the first time Karl touched soil that didn't belong to conquest. The dirt stuck to his hands like forgiveness. One evening, while returning from the fields, Karl noticed a small group of soldiers standing by the wire fence, staring west. Beyond it, the sunset bled into the horizon, purple and gold, the kind of beauty that mocked all uniforms. You could walk forever out there, Hans said. Karl nodded, and still be inside something. The fence shimmered in the light, a perfect metaphor, freedom visible, unreachable, defined by your own gaze. Sister Eleanor passed by then, carrying a pail of water. She paused, watching them. You boys look like statues, she teased softly. Hans grinned. We're learning American patience. She raised an eyebrow. That'll take a lifetime. He laughed, and even Karl's mouth curved. In that moment, the distance between guard and prisoner, captor and captive, flickered, thin as wire, fragile as dusk. By late August, the camp had changed. The men built a small chapel, carved wooden figurines, even started a soccer league. The Americans watched with half-amused admiration. Reed walked among them one afternoon and said to Karl, "Didn't expect this from soldiers trained to hate." Karl replied, "We were trained to win." Hate came free. Reed smiled faintly. "Well, here you're free to lose that too." That night, a storm rolled over the plains. The barracks shook, lightning flashing against the wire. Rain washed the dust from roofs, from faces, from memory. When dawn came, the air smelled new. Karl stepped outside barefoot, the ground cool beneath him. He looked at the sky, the same color as home, yet not. Somewhere a rooster crowed. The camp seemed smaller now, almost peaceful. He found a piece of paper drifting in the mud, a leaflet dropped by American planes weeks ago, its ink bleeding but still legible. Freedom is the right of all men. He turned it over, uncertain if it was meant as mockery or invitation. Inside the mess hall, men were already laughing, trading jokes in broken English, learning words like howdy and coffee. Karl tucked the leaflet into his jacket pocket. Later that morning, Captain Reed addressed the men. "You'll work the cotton fields next week," he said. "You'll earn your keep. You'll live decent, and so will we." His voice carried a weight that wasn't command but conviction. The men nodded. Even those who'd once saluted Hitler now saluted the rhythm of ordinary life. That evening, as the sun sank behind the barbed wire, Karl watched the American flag ripple above the camp. For the first time, it didn't look like a symbol of defeat but of contradiction, a nation capable of both war and mercy. He thought of home, of rubble and ashes, of all that waited for them beyond this unlikely peace. Hans came up beside him, hands in pockets. "You think they'll send us back soon?" he asked. Karl didn't answer right away. The air was heavy with cicadas, the faint smell of rain still lingering. Finally, he said, "Maybe, but I wonder if home is still home." The wind stirred the flag again, its fabric whispering against the pole like a question too large to answer. Somewhere behind them, Sister Eleanor was laughing with the guards, and the light from the mess hall spilled out through the windows, warm and gold. For the first time since the war began, Karl felt something he couldn't name, something dangerously close to belonging. But as he turned toward the horizon, he saw it, a convoy of trucks in the distance, kicking up dust along the road. More prisoners were coming. The war was far from over, and neither, it seemed, was his captivity. The sound of engines grew louder, rumbling like an echo of everything he thought he'd left behind. He straightened, heart caught between dread and wonder, and whispered to himself, "America, what are you doing to us?" By the spring of 1944, the barbed wire at Camp Hearn had begun to look less like a barrier and more like a strange kind of frame, one that enclosed a life the prisoners were slowly learning to fill. The Texas sun had bleached the posts pale, the grass had crept closer to the fence line, and inside, the rhythm of captivity had turned into something resembling habit. At dawn, the bugles still blew, but the sound no longer stung like command. It felt almost like a call to work, to motion, to living. The men who once marched in formation now carried shovels and hoes, their boots sinking into loam instead of mud and blood. Karl Müller knelt by a patch of earth near the western fence, his hands stained with soil. Around him, small green shoots had begun to push through the dirt, the beginnings of the prisoner's vegetable garden. It had been Hans's idea. "If we're going to rot here, we might as well grow something," he had said with that crooked grin of his. The guards allowed it, partly out of pity, partly curiosity. What could come from soil touched by enemies? Yet as weeks passed, rows of tomatoes, beans, and even a peach sapling took root. It was absurdly beautiful, this rebellion of life inside confinement. Each plant became a kind of prayer. They watered them with ration water and guarded them from rabbits with makeshift fences of twine. The Americans began to take notice. Captain Reed would pause on his rounds to watch them work, pretending it was just inspection, though he knew better. There was a peace in watching men grow food instead of grudges. "You've turned soldiers into gardeners," Sister Eleanor teased one afternoon. Reed smiled faintly. Maybe that's how wars end. Eleanor herself became part of the rhythm of the camp. She tended the infirmary, where colds, blisters, and homesickness took turns as the most common ailments. The men adored her quietly, respectfully, but their eyes softened when she passed. Hans once carved her likeness in wood, exaggerating her stern expression. When he showed it to her, she laughed so hard she nearly dropped it. "You've made me look like I command an army," she said. Hans shrugged. "You do." Even Karl smiled, though he rarely did these days. Letters arrived from home now and then, fragile as ghosts. They carried news of bombings, losses, and silence. One evening, Karl received word that his family's home in Frankfurt had been destroyed. He read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it under his pillow. The next morning, he was in the garden before sunrise, digging, planting, sweating like a man trying to bury grief in rows. When Hans joined him, Karl said without looking up, "If everything burns, at least something still grows." Hans didn't answer. He just handed Karl a seed. By midsummer, the garden had become the heart of the camp. Even the Americans came to admire it. On Sundays, the guards leaned against the fence, chewing tobacco, while Germans knelt among the vines, humming tunes that smelled faintly of home. It was a quiet truce made of sunlight and shared fatigue. A few prisoners had even started painting landscapes, Texas fields, rusted tractors, a sky too large to fit on canvas. The camp command approved exhibitions locals came to see. The irony was not lost on anyone. Art blossoming inside captivity. One day, Reed escorted a visitor, a local farmer who'd come to borrow laborers for his cotton fields. "They'll be treated fair," the man promised. "I just need hands." Reed agreed. The next week, several POWs rode out in trucks, free for the first time to see America beyond the wire. When they returned, their eyes were wide. "They live simply," Hans said, "but they smile easily." Another added, "They looked at us like we were men, not monsters." Even Karl felt something stir. Perhaps, he thought, the real battle was not between nations but between what people feared and what they might understand if they looked longer. In August, the Red Cross organized a concert. The prisoners built a small stage from scrap wood. They played Beethoven and folk tunes under strings of lanterns. Americans and Germans sat side by side, tapping their boots. Reed clapped along, pretending not to enjoy it too much. When the orchestra began Silent Night, someone laughed. It was far too early in the year, but soon the entire camp sang softly, the melody melting the air. For a moment, the war seemed like something that had happened to other people. Eleanor watched Karl from a distance that night. He was thinner now, but steadier, his eyes clearer. After the concert, she found him sitting near the fence, staring at the garden. "You play well," she said. "I didn't play," he answered. "Then you listen well." He smiled just barely. The silence between them was easy, the kind that didn't need filling. She glanced at the peach tree, its first fruit small and green. "That one's stubborn," she said. Karl looked up. "Then it belongs here." But not everything softened. Rumors spread of Allied victories, German defeats. Some prisoners grew restless, angry. "If the war is lost," one hissed, "then what are we now? Farmers for our conquerors." Karl didn't answer, though the question gnawed at him. His loyalty to Germany was like an old wound, healed on the surface, aching underneath. He still saluted instinctively at roll call, but his thoughts wandered elsewhere, to the garden, to Eleanor's quiet compassion, to the way Reed spoke of duty without hate. One humid afternoon, a new prisoner arrived, a sharp-faced young officer named Otto Brandt. He sneered at the gardens, the music, the laughter. "You've all gone soft," he said. "You've forgotten who you are." Karl bristled. "We remember too much," he replied. Otto spat in the dirt. "You're digging your own graves." The words hung heavy. That night, someone uprooted several plants, slashing the vines with a knife. No one confessed, but everyone knew. Karl replanted them silently at dawn, his hands trembling with rage and sorrow. "Even in a cage," he muttered, "some men only know how to destroy." Reed found him later, knees in the mud. "You don't have to fix everything," the captain said gently. Karl looked up. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Reed thought for a long moment. "Keep planting." It was simple advice, but it felt like revelation. Autumn arrived quietly. The fields beyond the camp turned gold. Inside, the peach tree bore fruit, small, imperfect but sweet. The men gathered around as Hans plucked the first one and handed it to Karl. "For you, her lieutenant," he said with mock ceremony. Karl bit into it. The taste was shockingly bright, like sunlight trapped in skin. "So this is Texas," he said softly. Hans laughed. "No, this is hope." That night, as the moon rose over the wire, Karl wrote a letter he knew might never be sent. "Dear Father," it began, "we are prisoners who have learned to be free. We till foreign soil, and it forgives us faster than our own." He paused, listening to the crickets. "If the war ever ends, I wonder which side of the fence I will miss more." He folded the page carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Beyond the barracks, faint music drifted from the recreation hall. Someone playing a harmonica, the same notes rising and falling like breath. The wind carried the scent of peaches and dust, a perfume of contradictions. Karl stood at the fence, resting his hand on the cold metal. The moonlight turned the wire silver, almost beautiful, like threads holding the night together. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the world was still burning. But here, inside this fragile boundary, men were learning how to grow things again. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he almost believed the garden would last forever. Then, far off in the dark, a siren wailed from the town, sharp, distant, unmistakable. War, it seemed, was not finished with them yet. Spring 1945 came late to Texas, as if the seasons themselves had paused to listen to the world falling apart overseas. The peach tree inside Camp Hearn bloomed early that year, petals pale as snow against a sky washed clean of winter. The prisoners stood beneath it one morning, staring at the blossoms like something miraculous. It was strange, Karl thought, that beauty could still find its way through barbed wire. By then, the war had become a rumor carried on the wind. Bits of news from guards, crackling radios, letters that arrived half-burned and water-stained. The men leaned closer whenever Reed read the bulletins aloud. "Berlin under siege," he'd say, or "Russians advancing." Some faces lit up in relief, others turned away. For Karl, each announcement felt like a blow and a bomb at once. Every victory meant the end of madness, but also the erasure of the world he once knew. Hans took it differently. "When it's over, maybe they'll let us stay," he said one night, sitting by the fence. He was eating a biscuit from the mess hall, savoring it like a last luxury. Karl frowned. "Stay? In America?" Hans grinned. "Why not? The soil here listens when you plant. Back home, even the ground is tired." Karl almost laughed, but didn't. He wanted to tell him that nations don't forgive that easily, that men like them would always be ghosts in foreign fields. But he kept silent. Sister Eleanor moved through the camp with quieter steps now. She'd seen too many headlines, too many photographs from Europe. When she treated the prisoners' minor wounds, she no longer asked about home. Most of them had none left. Once, she found Karl staring at a torn letter. "Bad news?" she asked softly. "No news," he replied. "Which is worse?" She nodded, understanding the weight of silence better than most. By April, the camp was restless. The guard had grown looser, almost friendly. The fences seemed thinner. Reed had stopped carrying his pistol on rounds. One morning, the radio in the mess hall crackled. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally." The words drifted like ash through the camp. No one cheered. A few men dropped to their knees. Others simply stared at the dirt. Freedom, it turned out, had no sound. Karl stood apart from the others, staring at the sky. He should have felt relief. He told himself that. But instead, there was a hollow space inside him, something vast and unclaimed. Hans came running, breathless, eyes wet. "It's over," he shouted. "Over." Karl managed to smile, but it trembled. "Yes," he said, "over." Then he turned away. That night, the Americans held a small celebration. Coffee, pie, laughter too loud to be natural. The prisoners watched from the barracks, some joining in the song, others retreating into thought. Karl sat by the window, the peach blossoms visible in the moonlight. He thought of his father, his brothers, his home in Frankfurt reduced to rubble. What was freedom? He wondered if everything it led was gone. A few days later, Captain Reed called the men together. His voice carried across the yard, steady but reluctant. "You'll all be processed for repatriation soon," he said. "It'll take time, but you'll go home." There was a murmur through the crowd, relief mixed with something darker. Hans whispered, "Home? Do we still have one?" Karl didn't answer. Reed must have heard, because he added, "You've earned respect here. Don't forget what that feels like." The days that followed were strange, like living between heartbeats. The men packed their meager belongings, yet no one seemed eager to leave. Work still went on. The garden, the repairs, the endless waiting. Eleanor found Karl again by the peach tree. She handed him a small book, worn at the edges. "Whitman," she said. "He talks about freedom the way you talk about soil." Karl turned it over in his hands. "Well, I understand it. Maybe not now," she said, "but someday." As weeks passed, rumors spread that some prisoners had refused to board the trucks in other camps. "They said they'd rather stay here," one guard whispered. Karl listened without comment, though a strange warmth flickered in his chest. One afternoon, while helping harvest vegetables from the garden, he caught Hans humming an American tune. "You've gone native," Karl teased. Hans shrugged. Better a foreigner in peace than a patriot in ruin. That evening, as the sun dropped low, the camp orchestra played again. The sound was gentle, almost weary, violins like birds too tired to fly. Reed stood by the gate, arms crossed, eyes distant. He'd spent years guarding these men, and now he'd have to send them away. Eleanor joined him. "They'll leave soon," she said. "Maybe," he answered, "but I'm not sure they'll ever go." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward Karl and Hans, standing near the tree. "Look at them. They found something here that doesn't have a border." In the barracks that night, someone began passing around paper and envelopes. Letters to home. Karl wrote slowly, his pen trembling. "My dear father," he began, though he didn't know if his father still breathed. "The war is over. We are told we will go home, yet I am not sure where that is. America has shown me something I cannot name, a mercy that makes me ashamed and grateful at once." He stopped, stared at the ink, and added, "If I ever return, I will plant trees." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The wind picked up, scattering petals from the peach tree across the yard. They drifted through the open Baroque windows, landing on blankets, on letters, on tired faces. Hans caught one and tucked it behind his ear. "Proof," he said, "that good things grow anywhere." The next morning, the trucks arrived, gray, dull, waiting. Guards stood ready, but there was no tension, only silence. Karl watched as men lined up, their belongings in small bundles. Reed called out names. Some stepped forward, others hesitated. Hans whispered, "We could just walk the other way. Disappear into Texas." Karl half smiled. "And then what?" "Then we live," Hans said simply. When Karl's name was called, he froze. The gate stood open, the road stretching beyond, shimmering with heat. He looked back once, at the garden, at the barracks, at the people who had become, impossibly, family. Reed met his eyes and gave a single nod. Eleanor was standing nearby, hands clasped. "You'll be all right," she said. "That's what you Americans always say," Karl murmured. "Maybe this time it's true." He stepped toward the truck, but stopped at the tree. Its branches swayed in the warm wind, heavy with fruit. He reached up and plucked a peach, turning it in his palm. The skin was soft, alive with sunlight. For a moment, he considered taking it as a souvenir. Instead, he placed it gently at the base of the trunk. "For whoever stays," he whispered. The truck engine roared to life. Dust swirled. The men climbed aboard, but Karl lingered at the edge. Hans looked back. "You coming?" Karl stared at the horizon. Beyond that line of heat and dust was a country he no longer understood, a language he might never fit back into. He felt the weight of the air, thick with memory and something else, possibility. Reed called out, "Lieutenant Müller." It was both an order and a question. Karl's hand tightened on the truck's railing. He took one last look at the camp. The gardens, the laughter echoing faintly from the kitchen, the flag rippling above it all. The war was over, yes, but something larger was beginning. He climbed onto the truck, sat beside Hans, and stared out as the gates rolled open. The wire gleamed in the sun, the same silver lines that once trapped them now blurring behind clouds of dust. As they drove away, the camp grew smaller until it looked like a memory itself, fragile and perfect. On the road, Hans broke the silence. "You think we'll ever come back?" Karl didn't answer. He was watching the sky, its blue endless and merciless, the color of both home and exile. In his pocket, the pages of Whitman's poems fluttered faintly in the wind, like something alive. He touched them once, as if to anchor himself, then looked ahead. The road stretched on, vanishing into the light. Somewhere far behind them, a peach fell from its branch and hit the ground with a soft, decisive thud. The war had been over for a year, but for some men, peace arrived like an unanswered letter. In 1946, the fields outside Herne were heavy with cotton again, the fences rusted and half-swallowed by weeds. The old barracks stood quiet under the Texas sun, ghosts of laughter and music trapped in their wooden walls. Most of the German prisoners had gone home months earlier, back to cities carved open by fire and hunger. But not all of them. A few remained behind, men who had discovered that captivity could feel safer than freedom. Karl Müller was one of them. He had returned to Germany only briefly, enough to see what was left of Frankfurt, the ruins stacked like tombstones, the air still smelling of smoke. His family was gone, his street reduced to dust and silence. For 3 months he tried to live there, sleeping in what had been his father's study, the roof gone, stars shining through. But every morning he woke with the same thought: this is not home anymore. One day, without telling anyone, he sold his last possessions and boarded a ship to New Orleans. From there, he rode a bus west until the roads began to look familiar. The endless sky, the flat horizon, the taste of dust and sunlight. When he reached the outskirts of Herne, he found Captain James Reed's old farm. The captain was gone, killed in a road accident months after the war ended, but his wife still kept the land with help from a few locals. She recognized Karl the moment he appeared at the gate. "You were one of them," she said, eyes narrowing in surprise. He nodded. "I work those fields," he said softly. "I like to work them again." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You don't sound like a prisoner anymore." Karl smiled back. "Maybe I never was." And so he stayed. Hans Becker returned too, half a year later, sunburned and grinning, claiming he'd missed the coffee. Together, they rented a small shack near the old campgrounds. The government had torn down most of the fences, but a few posts remained, standing crooked in the dirt like broken ribs. The men rebuilt the garden where the barracks once stood, planting beans, tomatoes, and peaches. "You think it'll grow again?" Hans asked one morning. Karl pressed a seed into the soil. It never stopped. Locals came to know them simply as the Germans. Some offered work, others only curiosity. A few didn't understand why they had returned when the world was free to them. But most grew used to their quiet presence, their good manners, their careful way of speaking. On Sundays, they joined the town picnics, sitting apart but smiling, as if waiting for permission to belong. Sister Eleanor, now married to a doctor in Houston, visited once. When she saw the peach tree standing tall behind the old fence, she cried. "It's still here," she whispered. Karl handed her a ripe fruit, warm from the sun. "So are we." The years had gentled him. The sharpness in his voice had turned into calm. Yet something restless still burned behind his eyes. He worked the land as if each seed were an apology, as if peace needed to be earned with calloused hands. Hans joked that Karl talked to the soil more than to people. "It listens better," Karl would say. One evening, near the start of summer, the wind carried the faint sound of an engine. Down the dirt road came a jeep bearing the U.S. Army insignia. Two officers stepped out holding papers. "Karl Müller," one asked, "you're living here without a visa. You're not a citizen." Karl nodded. "Not yet." They told him he would have to leave, that he was still technically under foreign status. Hans argued, furious. "He's done no harm. This man has fed half your town." The officers were firm, but not cruel. "We're just following orders." Karl said nothing. He stood quietly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning." That night, he couldn't sleep. The air smelled of peaches and rain. He sat outside under the tree, the branches heavy with fruit, the same tree that had grown through years of wire and war. Hans sat beside him. "We can run," he whispered. "Head north. Nobody would find us." Karl shook his head. "I'm tired of running." He picked a peach, turned it in his hand, and smiled faintly. "You remember what Reed said? Keep planting. Maybe that's all a man can do." At dawn, the officers returned. The sun broke across the horizon, lighting the fields in gold. Karl walked to the gate and turned back once more to the garden. The rows of green, the peach tree glowing like a crown in the morning light. Hans stood there, fists clenched, eyes wet. "You'll come back," he said hoarsely. "They can't stop you." Karl smiled, but there was a sadness in it, soft and infinite. "Maybe I already did." He stepped into the jeep without another word. As it drove away, the road filled with dust, and the fields shimmered in the heat. That evening, when the wind rose, a storm swept through the valley. Rain lashed the earth, lightning tore the sky open, and the peach tree bent but did not break. By morning, the sun returned, and droplets clung to every leaf like glass. Hans walked out into the garden and found something lying at the base of the tree. A small, weathered book, its pages damp but unbroken. Leaves of grass. He sat under the tree and opened it. Inside the cover was Karl's handwriting, neat and steady. "Freedom is not where you stand. It's what stands inside you." The wind rustled through the branches, scattering petals across the soil. Hans looked toward the horizon, where the road disappeared into light, and whispered, "You stubborn fool." Then he laughed through tears, tasting rain and dust, and something that felt a lot like peace. Years later, when the locals spoke of the old POW camp, they said it ended the day the fences fell. But those who knew better said it ended here, in a field of peaches planted by men who refused to hate, and, in their refusal, learned what it truly meant to be free.